Well, I think there's a lot of ways to go with that question that you alluded to with a bit of a wink, but I will start with the media-specific area, and I think that is one of the areas I think is that people consumed information through social media and news through social media at a much greater percentage than any past election. I think that's something that people are familiar with, but the question is, why does that matter? And why it matters is because there's a much lower barrier to entry to provide information and share information and be an originator of information on social media platforms, and therefore it doesn't go through the same quality control that I would say Washington Post information or the information on a range of online television, radio typically does. And what that means is that people can't differentiate, and people are receiving information that is not through a fact-checked editorial board or editor. It is the editor is the algorithm that puts information into people's social media feeds. And I think that has had a huge impact. People who say it didn't, I think, probably need to wait some more time for some analysis of why voters actually voted how they did before we make a conclusion.
So, hi, my name is Ruth, and I'm here to answer for all the sins of all the media through this entire election. Look, there has not been an election cycle where, in my now lengthy experience, where we've looked after the election and gazed at our navels and said, damn, we did a great job. And more important, where the rest of the players in our business looked and said, oh, that media, they did like even better than usual. So this one, in that sense, is no different from that. I think we saw, and this builds on some of what Jen said, three phenomena this election that conspired to make things look, to borrow from Norm Ornstein, and not get it exactly right, even worse than usual. And before I get to the even worse than usual, I think I really want to make sure that I don't forget to stand up for the really good things that we did. I can brag a little on the Washington Post because I'm on the editorial side, so I can brag a little bit on the news side. Look at the reporting that David Farenthold did about the Trump, thank you, yay, go David, about the Trump charitable, in air quotes, foundation. That was the best of journalism, and it wasn't just that, it was the Access Hollywood tape, it was good reporting that the New York Times did during the election with the tax returns. So we were not massive across the board failures. We pushed and pushed and pushed and did our jobs, however imperfectly. Three things happened this campaign. The first was Donald Trump. The second was the siloization, the increasing siloization through social media of voters' access to information. Access to is not exactly right. It's more consumption of information, because if you want it, you can get it. They're just deciding what diet it is they want to eat. And the third was this phenomenon of the rise of fake news. And the three of those together conspired to create a different atmosphere. I'm just going to say a few sentences about the Trump phenomenon. Under the normal rules of political gravity, what a lot of cable channels were accused of doing, which was giving Trump unfiltered airtime, should have brought him down, right? When I watch, personally, wall-to-wall coverage of a Trump rally, I walked away from my television set saying, you've got to be joking, okay? That was not how voters responded, obviously, at least enough of them. Is that the cable company's fault or the voters' fault? I'll let you decide. But when Trump, time after time, gets enormous amounts of attention for saying things like starting with John McCain isn't a war hero and going through the Mexican judge, and we all know the list of outrageous things that he's said, and gets an enormous amount of attention for those. The fact that he survives is just the difference between, it's not a journalistic failure, it's just that voters were in a different and particularly whatever adjective you'd like to insert at this point mood this cycle. But it did have an impact on the coverage that was really problematic for me in this sense. He was just the bright, shiny object in our journalism. And so it occupied all of our attention, the latest Trump outrage or Trump statement of the day. And it continues to do that, by the way, during the transition. And it distracted us as a collective from asking him really, and not just him, but any of the other candidates while they lasted, really serious questions about policy. And not entirely, not throughout the whole cycle, but for too long. And I think that, for me, is, if I were the editor of a newspaper rather than on the editorial side, where I would really kind of try to think through how we can do that piece better in the future. And when there is something so mesmerizing as a Trump-like candidate and something as inherently boring as how you are going to fund your infrastructure program exactly, how you can figure out how to make both of those forms of coverage work, because you can't ignore the bright, shiny object, but if you never pay any attention to the how and why and substance of campaigns, you do not end up in a good place.
Well, let me try to unpack some of what you've talked about, and let's talk first about the mainstream media. Do you all have a definition of mainstream media? I'd be interested in that. But Ruth, you were just a great defender of what the Washington Post has done. The mainstream media is not universally well regarded. It's not trusted by most voters, and it's not read by most of the millennials. How do you reclaim? How do you reassert? What is the role of mainstream media as you see it?
So I'm going to go back to David Fahrenthold, because I really do think that, I know when my two millennials at home were emailing me and saying, David Fahrenthold's going to win a Pulitzer this year, right? Or, this is incredible journalism. Okay, they are Washington kids and they're Washington Post kids, so they're not necessarily completely illustrative. But that stuff, or illustrative at all, that reporting broke through. And the Access Hollywood tape broke through. How do we get people to pay attention to us? I mean, this is I think the question is not as much how do we get people to pay attention to us as how do we generate a business model that gives us the resources that are necessary to do the excellent kind of journalism that my colleagues on the news side did this election, in order to the business model to get that done. But I would say I am not all that. If people don't trust us, that is obviously not great. But I would say that there were a lot of really, from my point of view, quite gratifying things that happened this election cycle. As now we have this capacity to, in the newspaper, see numbers that we never had before. So, for example, in one of the earliest moments, actually, of getting substantive questions asked of Donald Trump came to our editorial board, and good for him. A certain other candidate on the Democratic side never made time in her schedule to do it. So good for Donald Trump. He came, we asked him serious questions. We wrote an editorial about it, a transcript of that editorial board meeting. That's good news for journalism, and it's good news for our ability to get information to voters and readers. Similarly, we wrote extensive and really quite long editorials condemning Donald Trump, even after he came to see us. And those similarly got millions and millions of readers. This, to me, is good news, not bad news for journalism. It suggests that there is an appetite for quality reporting, there is an appetite for intelligent questioning, and there's an appetite for what I hope is intelligent opinion.
So, Jen, if you were to have another campaign that you were running, would you turn to the mainstream media, or do you think you would prefer to look at some of the other sources that are out there?
So first, I would say that the question, with all due respect, is the root of the problem. And I think the root of the problem that a lot of traditional newspapers have. And I read the Washington Post, I read the New York Times, but I'm the communications director at the White House. Of course I would. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of mainstream media, which I think people think of traditionally as national newspapers or even local newspapers, maybe network television, sees online digital media as not just a competitor, but the enemy and lesser than. There is a certain, putting my colleague, not my colleague, but my friend here aside or outside of this, and that is hugely problematic, because if the mainstream media, national newspapers can't figure out how to reach people, that's a root problem that they need to solve. And I think that in my dealings with a lot of newspapers, with very smart reporters, I think, first of all, and this is a sidebar, but I feel like I need to say it, I don't think that the media needs to get a grade or should get a bad grade from this election cycle, because elections are determined by winning hearts and minds. They're not actually determined by charts and policies. We may want it to be the other way, but it's rarely that way. How people should look at the media is the next year or two, and how, when Donald Trump is president, he performs as it relates to policy making and the analysis of policy making in government. That's an aside. Just wanted to say it. But so let me go back. So I think, and Ruth wrote this column last May about how there needs to be soul searching, which is with the media, with Democrats, with Republicans. I agree with all of that, including with Democrats. I think. True, but so maybe we have more soul searching. Fair enough. We certainly have soul searching to do. But with the mainstream media, I would say, the way we in the White House view the media is that it's a spectrum, right? There's the New York Times, there's the Washington Post, but there's also online outlets that do great, excellent work. Mike.com is a good one we've done work with. BuzzFeed has done some interesting things. It's not all cat videos, I promise you. So I'm not here, I'm not in the media, but I think this us versus them is very problematic. And one of the soul-searching things the media needs to do, the mainstream media, is figure out how to actually reach people and how to change how they do that.
Because Jen and I were talking about this earlier. Here's an astonishing fact about the Obama presidency. Well, no, it's okay.
No, go ahead.
Because you're going to explain, explain why that's a totally sensible choice, right? So President Obama came, when he was President-elect Obama, for an editorial board meeting, because once again, we had failed to lure him when he was a candidate. So he came for an editorial board meeting, and this is a true fact. That was the last time he spoke on the record to the Washington Post. Through 2 terms, he has not given us an editorial board interview or an interview to our news reporters, despite, I think, numerous requests. There have been reports about off-the-record meetings with columnists, so I don't want to, I'm just citing those reports. But so amount of time spent on the record with Washington Post, 0. Amount of time spent between 2 ferns with Zach Galifianakis, or with a bunch of YouTube, I'm going to say this in a provocative way so Jen can respond, with a bunch of YouTube video bloggers with purple hair, much greater. That's, I'm going to be just a little snarky about this. That's unsettling, and I think not really, as a White House, productive of the sort of reporting that you just said you wanted to see of us from the Trump White House about deep substantive policy issues. So you now
Well,
defend yourself.
no, I don't feel I need to defend myself. I mean, I feel my responsibility is to help determine how the president can reach the American people. The Washington Post's reach and viewer and readership is significantly lower than a huge number of media outlets out there that do reporting, that report on smart issues, that ask challenging questions. So it's not my role to solve that for the Washington Post. I think I would say that the president has done interviews with the New York Times. He's done interviews with The Atlantic. He's done interviews with Charlie Rose, George Stephanopoulos, Nora O'Donnell. I don't think any of those people would. I think they'd strongly defend the notion that they aren't serious, hard-hitting journalists. I think this goes back to the question of what your role is. The benefit of having so many outlets out there is that you have many more choices. And many more choices as a professional who's working on behalf of the president or a senator or an elected official or an organization. You have to determine, and one of the choices we make is how to reach the audience we're trying to reach. Oftentimes that is millennials, sometimes it's senior citizens, sometimes it's middle-aged Latinos. I mean, it really depends on who you're trying to reach. And that's a lot of how we make our decisions. I had hoped we'd be able to do a Washington Post interview, as I told Ruth, and I think there are a lot of reporters, some of whom she's mentioned today, who've done incredible and amazing work. And I don't think this question of how the mainstream media and I hate that term mainstream media because I think there's lots of ways to define it, reaches more people is an easy one, because media companies are businesses, and it's not just a public service. Providing the information is a public service, but there are other factors beyond that.
Well, you just spoke about the balkanization of the audience and the multiplicity of media. And we heard the vice president earlier sort of reminisce about an earlier age. And I'm in his generation, and I remember when it was only Walter Cronkite. And actually there were three networks at the time. But virtually everybody in the United States got their news from one of three sources, all of which were within inches of one another on any kind of a spectrum. Now it's a completely broad range, as you were saying. And I was asking earlier about your thoughts on one end of that range. There's the other end, which may be the source, or at least the vehicle, for some of these fake news that you had both mentioned. And I'd like you to spend a little bit of time talking about that as a phenomenon, and given our traditions of free speech and our seeming enthusiasm for these multiple media unchecked sources, can anything be done? What can be done? And I live very close to Comet Pizza, so I understand that some of the fake news has real ramifications. Long questions, but let's talk about that end of the spectrum and get off the mass media part. And Jen, you can start if you'd like.
Sure. So I would say this is one of the most important questions that can be asked right now, because there are a lot of questions we don't know the answer to, even as a government, about who these fake news sources are, whether there are actors with malintent behind it, and it's not just a bunch of young teenagers in Macedonia making up stories and pushing them about Donald Trump. We don't know a lot of the answers to those questions. Once we know the answers, it may become even more alarming than it is now. But I would say that There are a couple of things that I think we need to, and I think a lot of the social media companies are beginning to think through. But we as a society, as a government, I think as media organizations and companies need to push hard on, which is if you're a social media platform where the majority of the public or a large swath of the public is getting their information about an election, do you have an editorial responsibility? I think the answer should be yes, in some capacity. I don't know what form that takes. But I think the current situation is clearly not sustainable. I'll just add one challenge that I think isn't talked about enough that a lot of these companies I think will have to grapple with is the standards around the globe. Because here in the United States, we are fortunate to have a free and open media and press. We, whether people like what we say or not, have 3 briefings from the government every day where reporters can come and ask questions. That's rare, and the number of countries with a free press, it continues to decrease. So there's a question of standards. If you look at a country like Russia or China, where people are receiving information from state-run media that is like a cousin of fake news, and maybe a good learning device for us all to look at. Does that mean that social media platforms prevent these outlets from putting information online on their sites or not? And how do you draw the line? So I think there are some very hard questions, but I certainly think that there are some serious changes that need to take place.
So I don't pretend to have the solution to the fake news problem because it's a very, very complicated problem. It's really easy to say Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. We all know that's not true. We all know it's fake. You could take it down. But once you then get into, it's a very slippery slope about truth that goes from there to, man-made global warming and on. And who do you want to put in charge of making that determination? And even if you could put people or computers in charge of making that determination, can you really scale it? Because Facebook and other social media are global platforms in multiple languages, and so it's a really big conundrum for them. It's also really essential for them and everybody else to try to figure out a way to figure this out, to try to give some priority, this little self-serving, in their algorithms to trusted news sites, and to push those up and suppress the others. But I went and I was looking at some of the things, the fake news things that have been tweeted, and the thing that's alarming about it is that if you are disposed to a certain point of view, it's conceivable that you would believe that the fake news is real because it looks real. It doesn't have the feel of, something slapped together. It's really easy for kids who know how to code to put it up and make it look real. So we could say, civic education and educate high school students and lower about news literacy, and I think that's really important, but it's hard. And so you have this phenomenon, for example, of people who are been nominated or chosen for very high and responsible positions in government who seem to have been taken in by this. And so underlying the phenomenon of fake news is the absolute willingness of people apparently to believe the craziest worst of people. And the Pizzagate situation, in which I've actually been, turns out to my surprise, because I was caught up in a weird way in Pizzagate, I myself am a pedophile, caught up in a child sex ring because there's some Pizzagate things. And I've gotten nasty tweets, but I've also gotten really sincere emails from people worried about this. And so we are now in a society that not only is inundated with fake news, but where a lot of people are so unhappy or disgusted or angry or whatever that they're disposed to believe it. And so that's the other part of the fake news problem that I think we're going to have to figure out a way to address.
Well, I'd like to stay on media literacy for a minute, because I think that is critically important with the environment that we have now. And I've always learned that the answer to bad speech is more speech that corrects the speech. I don't know if that's possible. That would be going to the source. Media literacy is going to the recipient. And I'd like your views on which might be the more productive, and what you think, if anything, either the news media itself or government should do. We've got another campaign coming up in 2 years, and then a presidential in 4. What do we want to think about and start doing to enhance our ability to discern what's being said to us?
Sure. Well, I think if people, I looked at the statistics, and I'm sure you've seen these too, of kind of how many people are tricked by fake news, and they're shocking. I mean, it was something like 80% of high school students couldn't differentiate between a fake news story and a real news story. It was, and you could go on and on. There are some very interesting statistics out there. There definitely needs to be a education campaign. What format that should take? Maybe it's through the media. Maybe it's through the government. Maybe government should play a role in that. I think that's an interesting question. I'm not too hopeful about the next administration taking that on, but we'll see. So I would encourage them to, I'll just say. But, one thing I think that there hasn't been enough discussion on is native advertising. And I don't know if many people know even what that is. It's sort of evil genius, as I'll say, is, if you go to even a media site or many websites, advertisers, or I should say companies or people who are trying to advertise do what's called native advertising, where the materials presented look exactly like a news story, exactly in the format of the outlet that they're advertising on. Now, that's confusing. So yes, we need to do a media campaign, but are we making it harder for people, individuals who are busy and just maybe they're trying to find Ruth's column or who knows, to try to find information? And I think that's a problem. And one, we're in a stage where it's very easy to differentiate when you're watching television. If you're watching, This Is Us, my new favorite show. If you're watching... Oh, it's so good. So if you're sorry, we were having an aside, but if you're watching a show like that and it's a commercial, it's a commercial, and you can go get a popcorn or a snack or whatever.
It wasn't always thus. The FTC for years was worried about Saturday morning television when Bugs Bunny would run for 20 minutes, and then Bugs himself would sell toothpaste. No, he wasn't selling toothpaste. It was normally sugared cereal or other such things, and they insisted on breaks, and the following is a paid commercial advertisement, and it couldn't be Bugs Bunny or even Captain Kangaroo. It had to be a different type person. I interrupted.
No, this is spoken as a regulatory expert here. So this is exactly the point, right? Is that there have been laws and policies that have been put in place about media and advertising. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV at all. But that have been put in place as a result. So are we at a stage where online media, online advertising, all of this has been exploding over the past couple of years? It's fascinating. But do we need to take a closer look at how this is approached from a government perspective as well, which I think is a question that future administrations and legislators will have to deal with.
So that makes me really super nervous to talk about government being involved in, more nervous than for Facebook to decide what's real news and what's fake news, or what's trusted news and what's less trusted news. Any government, no, but any government, or even to tell people how to figure it out. It just makes me nervous. It makes me nervous for any administration. It makes me particularly nervous for the administration advised by
You don't even like rules
Breitbart
that say
News.
that say this. We are now going to break for a commercial announcement.
So, for example, the FTC, which I know a little bit about, having been married to somebody who worked there, got involved in requiring bloggers who received freebies to disclose that it was a freebie. That seems like a perfectly legitimate disclosure rule, but I just have this kind of instinctive antipathy to government involvement in telling people how to consume or understand news. That feels like another slope I don't want to go down.
Okay. Do we have some questions from the audience? Apparently we do.
Let's begin with this one. False equivalency. Somebody in the audience wants to know how the press would police false equivalency. We have more. And if I could just append something to that, your reaction in that regard to the editor of the New York Times saying that the traditional standards of journalism in the context of this year's election required suspension. That is to say that there had to be somewhat more editorial judgment in the news reporting process.
Sure. That's a totally fair and legitimate question, and I think this campaign and the particular people who were running in this campaign, and I'm not mincing words, I mean Donald Trump, did require taking fact-checking from a sidebar situation and incorporating it into the main story. And I think that took some time and it took some adjusting on our part. And I think it has some potential downside issues of going too far and sort of turning off. You want to make sure that to the extent possible, your readers are going to trust you. So when you use a word like false, that seems to me to be okay, as long as you can demonstrably prove that a statement is false. When you use a word like lie, that to me feels like you're connoting intent and you're going further than you need to go, and you're not going to necessarily convince people with that. So I think that we had this campaign of education institutionally among different news organizations about how far we were willing to go and how we wanted to do it in terms of calling out false news or false assertions and how we were going to deal with them as news organizations. And I think that's still a work in progress, but I think we've gotten we've moved in a pretty good place there. On the false equivalence question, and I get this a lot, I simultaneously spent a lot of this election writing brutally critical things about Donald Trump, and I also spent some of this election writing brutally critical things about Hillary Clinton. And I think both of those were pieces of doing my job. And I know but it wasn't for me, it wasn't half and half. There's a lot of different ways to calculate these numbers. I think that both candidates came with different magnitudes of flaws, but they did come with flaws, and for us to ignore one's flaws because the other ones were greater is also not doing our job. I think to ignore substance across the board is not doing our job, but it is a fact of journalism, kind of like a law of journalistic physics, that outrageous statements are going to trump boring policy statements, and scandal and issues relating to scandal or questionable activity are going to trump policy statements. And so was there too much attention to Clinton's emails given the scope of other things going on? Perhaps, but that doesn't mean it was not a legitimate and important source of discussion. I wrote both that her handling of it was really problematic, the original decision to do it was problematic, and that it was clear to me well before James Comey said it was clear to the FBI that it was in no way close to a criminally prosecutable matter. I don't feel I'm losing a lot of sleep at night these days. I'm not losing a lot of sleep about false equivalence.
Ruth is in the media, so she is really the expert. But I will just add that one of the things that I think was challenging, I would assume for media, was that there's a long tradition in the country of elected officials and their staff saying things that are accurate or true. And I think that went out the window a bit this election cycle. And so whereas historically, a story may lead with something a candidate or a very senior staffer might say, or a chyron on television might say that, and that's totally normal, especially because that's how news is being made. It took a while to kind of figure out, I think, or unwind how to handle that, because that wasn't always the case. So that's just the one add I'd make.
Here's another question. One of the audience noticed, and I'm quoting, established media having more of a left, or as the case may be, right lean in reporting, not just editorials. Is that a fair case statement? Is it to compete with more niche or attention-grabbing online sources, and should we be worried about this trend?
I'm sorry, are we too left or too right?
No, it's the idea that the press is sorting out across the board into publications with defined points of view that are creeping into news and not just appearing in editorials.
Well, and I think what we should be concerned about is people, the snippy way of saying, the shortest way of saying this, we should be concerned about people not getting their information from reasonably neutral news organizations, whether they're networks or publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or whatever. I'm not going to keep listing because I'm just going to get in trouble if I keep listing. But just sorting themselves out to glean information from lefty sites or righty sites, or you only watch Fox News or you only watch MSNBC. They're not equivalent. But I think to the extent that you don't get the full gamut of news, you're depriving yourself, and it's clear that the social media algorithms are making that easier and easier, or even harder and harder to avoid. I don't think that we feel an institutional pressure to go in one direction or another. We have news pages that do news reporting, and we have a editorial page that simultaneously can make Jen's White House unhappy and Donald Trump unhappy. And I know that's like the cheapy way of saying we must be doing something right, but I kind of think we're doing something right.
Jen?
Yeah, I would just say that this is, there are a lot of news organizations that have been around a long time, including the Washington Post, but including a lot of local newspapers that are not as young as some of the online outlets. A lot of the online outlets are not left or right leaning either. There are some that are down the middle as well. But the benefit, to Ruth's point, of getting information from a compilation of the well-known, well-established outlets is that there are days where we are cursing the Washington Post editorial board pages. There are days where we like what they have to say. The same is true of the Times. The same is true of the Journal. I mean, it expands the gamut. And so, this is an area, I think, where there's a lot of individual responsibility, and one that I think people don't think about enough. What the president often says to us is to read broadly, including with people you disagree. And I think that's some of the best advice I've received, and I would certainly pass on to others. It's painful to do, but it's important to do. And, I often will turn on Fox and see what they have to say about what we're doing, because it's important to know what they're saying and what the view is and what a certain population of the country is hearing. So
this is a question about a different form of potential. I'm not talking about here bias, but whether or not a media organization might be sort of constituted in its reporting ranks and its editorial board to miss something in the body politic because the demographics, the socioeconomic position, the politics are unfamiliar. The question is, the group of white non-college educated Rust Belt voters that surprised the campaigns wasn't on their, meaning the campaign's radar. Why weren't they on the media's either?
Well, I mean, I think they were, as we saw the polls. The polls might not have had been right on the precise state-by-state basis, but I think we heard a lot about white, non-college educated, working class, particularly male voters during the campaign, and there was a lot of reporting about them and interviewing of them. You're not going to have a editorial board with non-college educated people on it. So, I mean, we talk a lot about the benefits of diversity in a newsroom. That's and certainly an editorial board is a kind of strange place to talk about ideological diversity, and newsroom actually probably is a better place to talk about ideological diversity, but you don't really want to be conscious of it because you don't want to pick ideologues for your news reporters. Let me just be clear, I'm not in any way arguing that we were like totally on top of the pulse of the people, nor that we were very well placed to be on top of the pulse of the people, but I don't think it's fair to say that we were somehow ignorant or non-cognizant of what was going on.
Jen,
Nor were the campaigns.
Jen,
Yeah,
do you have thoughts?
Everybody missed it. So I think this is a case where everybody, to some degree, there was some reporting. You know, the campaigns had some sense. You know, you have some sense because you spend enough time, a little bit of time in the country, not enough, right? And some of this is the problem of the echo chamber in Washington and people hearing from each other and only talking to each other. How do you get out of that? It's harder than you think. But it's clearly a case where everybody needs to do more. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, media, because clearly we weren't hearing and listening to what was happening in the country and what people were feeling and what they were not feeling like they were getting from the government, elected officials, and certainly from the losing campaign.
I want to say one thing to that, which is accepting a little bit more responsibility. In the olden days, Dave Broder taught young political reporters that what we needed to do was go talk to voters, and we needed to go door knock, and you would knock on people's doors and ask them how they were feeling and what they were concerned about and what they thought about candidates. We got kind of mesmerized about models and analytics and the predictive ability of science, and we forgot that we are the best focus group conveners and interviewers of all, because that's what we do or are supposed to do for a living. And so to the extent that this campaign makes us a little bit less reliant on the supposed near perfect science of polling and a little bit more going back to what Dave Broder taught us, I think that would be a very good thing.
Yeah, and the truth is, it's the same lesson, though a different objective for campaigns, because clearly, Democrats didn't just lose the White House. Democrats didn't lose Senate seats that everybody thought Democrats would win. Democrats only won 6 House seats, 3 of which were through redistricting. So clearly, this is a time for some self-reflection, and part of that is not listening to voters and relying too much on data. And data has been data is compelling, it's interesting, it tells you something that you can never gather in terms of the full scope, either as a reporter, I assume, or as a government or campaign official about the country. But it is imperfect, and clearly something was, the pulse of the country was missed. And I would just say there's one communications lesson here too, which is that what we shouldn't do as communications professionals, I would say, is get too far down the data-driven communications, where it's so dissected into different sections of society of who we're communicating specific messages with. Because if you don't have a tent pole of what you're trying to say, then the tent's going to fall down because no one is hearing kind of what your overarching passion and what your overarching message is. And I think that's something that Democrats, I should say, all of us, I am one, need to take a look at coming out of this campaign as well.
Well, so we're coming close to the end of the question period, and I want to read the one question that looks like the person putting the question was quite anguished about the failure of the media. So, Ruth, you get a chance to be defensive, and Jen, you get a chance to be very statesmanlike. The question is the following: how is it possible that with respect to one of the most important issues of the day, climate change, not one, and the underlining is under one, question was asked of Clinton and Trump at the debates, question mark, the journalists, underline, failed. Right? Wrong, Ruth. 3 debates.
I don't think I'm going to be in the position of defending the lack of questioning on that subject. I think it's a very important subject, and there was a question at the town hall from a voter that touched on energy but did not touch on climate, and I think that's really unfortunate. All I can say in our defense, and this kind of goes back to the bright, shiny object point that I was making earlier, in the way that really took away from what we should have been doing during the campaign, is that when Donald Trump came to the editorial board, we did ask him about climate change. He said he was not a big believer in the human contribution to climate change. It was very different than what he said to the New York Times after the election, and I think it really bears some further questioning. We can't, debate questions aren't the three presidential debates, as important as they are, cannot be the totality of our questioning, our serious questioning of candidates, as much as voters look at them and use them. The paradox of Donald Trump in particular was that there has never been a candidate who made himself more accessible to, during the time that he was, more accessible to more media more constantly, and was not adequately questioned about many things. And I could list you things that he was never questioned about during the course of the campaign that he should have been asked.
I think everything Ruth said is fair. Everybody doesn't see the totality of every interview that every candidate does, or every elected official does. Even media doesn't see every interview the elected officials do. I'll say on climate change specifically, this is an issue the president cares very deeply about. And when I came back to the White House about 1.5 years ago, he said, "This is the issue I want people to really know that I'm focused on and I care about." And I said, I don't think people really know that. And I don't think people have digested that. And, the reality is we had to work really, really hard at that, because it is not an issue that felt sexy or edgy. It probably should be. But what was interesting is that several months went by. We did a couple of trips that were more visual, et cetera. But we did an interview with CBS where we pitched them on doing a climate change focused interview. And they were like, "We care about that issue. We do substantive stuff. Okay, fine. But we want to do some news of the day stuff. Fine. Ask whatever you want. Great." So we did that. The climate change portion of the interview it had a farther reach. More people watched it than watched the news of the day portion that aired in that interview, which was surprising to them. It was thrilling to me. And I think some of this is not, at this stage especially, governing is different from campaigning, not underestimating the intelligence of voters, of people, of the American people, including millennials, which is, I think, a mistake often government makes or elected officials make about what issues millennials care about. But this is one of those issues, I think, that has been slow to come to the public radar in a way that it should. And if you look at polling, we just said data is imperfect. It is. But the percentage of people who care about climate change is a lot lower than it should be. I don't know why that is. It should be a lot higher, but that's something that will need some more work. Put it on the long list of things that need more work.
Okay, I'm going to turn the panel, thank you very much. I'm going to turn the panel back to Sally, just to note, by the way, that the next panel ties in beautifully because it's going to be from the social media side of the perspective, and then we're going to hear from the voters via Fred Yang, who's coming to finish things off, to speak about what the data tells us about what the voters were really thinking. Sally?
I want to thank our panelists for a very exciting discussion, not too defensive either.
and to give you all a 5-minute break. Make it 7 if you need it. And then we've got a last panel and another very interesting presentation by Fred Yang. So back in your seats, please, by 20 after. Thank you very much.